Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
My sister called me emotionally draining, rolled the phrase across her tongue like she had just discovered a shiny new therapy word, and then used it like a passcode to get me disinvited from Christmas. And I stood there with my winter coat unbuttoned and my hands full of the usual casserole and wine and last-minute gift cards, realizing in a single slow blink that the person who had spent years quietly keeping everyone else's boat afloat had just been pushed overboard and handed the blame for splashing. I did not raise my voice or plead for a place at the table, because I had already played that part every December since college, carrying the insurance premiums and the tuition payments and the extra grocery runs and the emergency flights. All of it smoothed over with brittle jokes about being the reliable one, the strong one, the you know she'll take care of it one, while Jessica perfected the art of kneading, and Mom perfected the art of praising her for being so spirited while asking me, in the soft voice she uses for invoices, to cover the difference just this once. I wish I could say the label surprised me, but the truth is it fit into a neat little slot in the family machine, and I watched the gears turn with a kind of clinical detachment that felt new and dangerous. Because for the first time I could see how close they all stood to the heat of what I had been financing, and how cold they seemed when they were counting on it without naming it, as if money arrived like weather, and I was simply the wind. The group chat filled up with cheerful plans that did not include me. Dad posted a photo of the tree from an angle that hid the bare side, and Mom sent a single line that read, "It might be best for everyone if you sit this one out and focus on your healing," which would have been generous if she had not attached a Venmo request for stocking stuffers at the exact same time, labeled traditions, like a punchline that had waited patiently for its cue. I took a long breath that tasted like old expectations, and I pictured the years I had spent subsidizing peace, and I realized peace was not what they wanted from me, because peace would have meant boundaries and honesty and equal shares. And what they wanted was the quiet hum of my wallet doing its domestic chores while I nodded along and laughed at the right spots and accepted the role of dependable background character who never needs a chair at the head table because she is busy paying for the table. That sounds bitter, and it is, but it is also practical, and practicality has a way of cutting through holiday candle smoke and cinnamon nostalgia to reveal how everything actually works. The night after I was uninvited, I put on the kind of sweater you wear when you know you might cry and you do not want to ruin anything nice, and I opened the laptop that has seen every budget I have written since my first real job. And I pulled up the portals that had made me the unthanked administrator of our family life, the quiet treasurer, the person who knew which premiums were on autopay and which tuition line items were set to withdraw on the 15th, and I stared at the stack of logins like a row of locked doors that I had been holding open with my foot while everyone else walked through without noticing my leg was shaking. I thought about Jessica's message, the one with the phrase that started this, and I thought about every December where I bought one more thing so that she would not feel small and Mom would not feel stressed and Dad could make his speech about unity. And I asked myself a new question that felt like a match struck in a dark room. Who would I be if I stopped paying for the version of me they preferred? I am not a villain, and I am not a saint. I am a woman who has learned to balance a checkbook and a mood in the same week, and I have learned that sometimes real kindness requires a hard spine and a steady hand, and sometimes love needs a budget line you cannot move. So I did something that looked ruthless from the outside, but felt like oxygen from the inside. I clicked into the health insurance plan where Jessica had sat like an extra passenger in a car I was fueling. And I read the terms twice because there is a difference between anger and action, and I wanted action, not a tantrum, not a gesture, but a change that matched the sentence she had chosen for me. The policy allowed removal with notice, and the screen asked me to confirm that I understood the consequences, and I did, because consequences had been my specialty for years, only they had always landed on my side of the ledger. My finger hovered for a long, long moment while the radiator hissed like it was trying to talk me out of it, and the city outside pushed winter against the glass, and I felt the old guilt reach for me with careful hands. The way guilt does when it thinks it knows your soft spots, and then I thought about the empty chair I was being told to accept at a table I had paid for, and the word healing dropped into my mind like a coin in a church box, and I pressed confirm. and the portal spun, and the plan refreshed without her name. The house across the alley flashed a string of colored lights on and off, and I closed the laptop, and the room went quiet in a way I had not heard in years, not the quiet of being shut out, but the quiet of shutting a door that had swung on my hinges for far too long. I know exactly how this sounds, and I am not asking for applause, because this was not noble, and it was not pretty. It was surgical, and it was overdue, and it was the first of several cuts I had avoided for fear of bleeding, even though I had been bleeding out slowly for more seasons than I can count. I stood up, poured water into a glass like I had to relearn how to care for a human, and I told myself that if they wanted a Christmas without me, they could also have a budget without me, and that was not cruelty, that was math. The phone lit on the counter with a new voicemail from Mom, the subject line preview showing only the first few words, and I felt the floor tilt, because it looked like the apology I had always begged for and never received, and I almost pressed play. Almost opened the gate before the dogs remembered they could run. I did not press play. I forwarded the confirmation email to a folder labeled Resolutions, because I wanted the reminder that I could do hard things and survive them. And then I opened the tuition portal and stared at the payment schedule that had kept Jessica in seminars where she learned new words with which to diagnose me, and I smiled without humor because I already knew what I was going to do next, and the cursor in the upper right corner blinked like a metronome counting down to the moment my decision would stop being a thought and become a record. The first voicemail from my mother came the morning after Christmas, her voice climbing up and down the scale of practiced grief, pleading with me to at least consider the bigger picture, which, in her language, always meant the picture where Jessica smiled in the center, and I held the frame steady, invisible but essential. I listened to it once while tying my hair back for work, and then again while making coffee, and by the third time I realized that I was not hearing a mother begging her daughter to come home, but a treasurer begging her bank not to close. The weight of that recognition settled into my chest like a stone, and instead of loosening, it pushed me forward, because once you admit that you have been treated like a transaction for long enough, the only choices left are to keep signing the checks or to change the terms entirely. The insurance company's confirmation email sat in my inbox like a silent witness, and I found myself opening it 3 or 4 times a day just to remind myself that the action had been real, that I had not dreamt my first step into self-preservation. The small satisfaction of it was not loud or flashy, but steady and precise, like the first cut in a long seam. Days passed quietly, and then the ripple began, because Jessica must have opened a letter from a hospital visit she thought would vanish into the bottomless void of "my sister will cover it." The call logs filled with her number, her name flashing red like an alarm I refused to hear, and each missed call hardened the line between us until the idea of answering felt like a betrayal of the woman I was trying to become. When the final week of December arrived and the city rang with half-hearted fireworks left over from Christmas sales, I opened the tuition account that I had been feeding for over 2 years. The one that sent automatic withdrawals into a graduate program Jessica had once described as a chance to reinvent herself. Reinvention, of course, meant another cycle of bills landing on my desk, another round of excuses about why she could not take on a part-time job, and another round of applause from my parents about how brave she was for chasing her dreams. The program itself was not cheap, and every month I told myself I was investing in her stability, that once she had the degree she would finally stand on her own. Yet every receipt had carried a sting, because while she was learning how to analyze literature or write polished essays on social behavior, I was the one sitting late at night rebalancing my savings account and telling myself it was temporary. I hovered over the cancel option for nearly an hour, pacing the apartment, pouring a second glass of wine that I did not need, and replaying years of conversations where Jessica called me so serious whenever I asked about repayment. My mother's words echoed too, especially the countless times she said, "You're the strong one, the one who understands responsibility." Responsibility had become my leash, and I realized that if I let it tighten one more time I would choke on it. So I clicked. The confirmation page opened, and I signed my name electronically in the space that asked for account holder, because that was what I had always been to them, the holder, the keeper, the safety net. This time, I was signing not for them, but against them, and the difference felt electric in my veins. The fallout did not wait long. Within 48 hours, I had 3 emails from the university's financial office, polite but sharp, pointing out that payment had not been received and that the account holder would need to address the balance to avoid disruption. I read each one with a calm that surprised me, sipping my coffee as if the words had nothing to do with me, and in truth they no longer did, because I was removing myself from that role piece by piece. Jessica's messages turned venomous almost instantly, her texts arriving in bursts of capital letters accusing me of proving why I was toxic and unworthy of a family. I stared at those words on the glowing screen and almost laughed, because if paying for her life had been my supposed way of earning worth, then what exactly had her endless taking proven about her own value? The moment of decision came when another text lit up my phone late at night, a paragraph so long it filled the entire screen, mixing insults with pleas in a tone only she could manage, as though she were both queen and victim at once. I read it once, then twice, and then with a calm that bordered on eerie, I opened the settings and pressed block. Her number vanished from my reach, and with it went years of obligation disguised as sisterhood. The silence that followed was not empty but full, heavy with all the words I would never have to read again. For the first time in my life, I had turned the tap off, and the sound of nothing was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I knew it would not stop there, that Mom would escalate, that Dad would send his clumsy speeches about unity and faith, that Jessica would find new ways to claw back what I had taken. But in that moment, standing barefoot on the kitchen tile with the phone dark and silent in my hand, I realized I had crossed the second threshold, and there was no way back to the woman who used to believe that buying peace could ever equal belonging. The week between Christmas and the New Year has always felt like a narrow hallway with lights flickering at both ends. And as I walked down it this time with my phone set to silence and my sister's number sealed behind a block that felt less like a button and more like a locked steel door, I discovered that my mother could reinvent persistence in ways that would have impressed a collections agency, because she called from her phone and then my father's, then the landline they never use except for election seasons and emergencies, then from an unknown number that turned out to be the neighbor with the white dog, and through each ring and buzz and voicemail preview I could hear this same melody of contrition wrapped around demands, the soft apologies for harsh words thrown in the moment, stitched to instructions for repairs I was supposed to perform, as if regret were a coupon and I could simply present it at the counter where reality issues fresh benefits. I listened to the first voicemail all the way through, absorbing the pauses, the way she inhaled like she was lifting something heavy, and the way she used the phrase, "We are a family," not as a promise, but as a contract term that had somehow escaped fine print for years. And when it ended, I understood with a clarity that chilled me that every plea was ultimately a request to resume the role, to slide quietly back into the slot that kept their machine running, and that any talk of healing or unity would dissolve the moment the balances were restored. I gave myself a single hour to consider whether I should take a softer path, not because I believed it would lead somewhere better, but because I wanted to respect the part of me that had spent years believing diplomacy could teach arithmetic to people who refused to count. And when the hour ended, I opened my email and wrote a message with the kind of calm that only comes from long preparation, addressing both of my parents by their first names rather than the titles that once bound us, thanking them in measured language for the years we had shared and the traditions we built, and then listing, one by one and without adjectives, the changes already made and the ones that would follow. The removal of Jessica from my health insurance plan with the effective date clearly noted, the cancellation of tuition payments with institutional contacts provided for any questions they might choose to ask themselves, the termination of the automatic monthly grocery transfer to my mother's account that had been labeled holiday cushion regardless of season, and the end of my streaming, data, and cloud storage add-ons that had allowed half the family to live across my passwords like tenants who never noticed the roof over their heads required shingles and nails. I wrote that I would not be answering calls for a while and that any necessary communication could be sent by email, and I closed with a sentence that surprised me as I typed it, a simple line that read, "If love is real, it should survive without invoices." And then I pressed send, not because I wanted a reply, but because I needed a record that I had spoken like an adult who understood the cost of her own voice. The response arrived at dusk, 2 paragraphs from my mother that began with how much she loved me and ended with a warning about how unforgiving the world can be to a woman who chooses distance over family. And as the room dimmed and the radiator clicked like a metronome, I noticed the sentence that gave the game away, the one where she wrote, "We all hurt each other sometimes, but we cannot turn off support when feelings get bruised," which would have been wise if support had been emotional and mutual rather than financial and one-directional, and I felt, with something like grief, the final frayed string between what I needed and what they wanted snap and fall soundlessly into the dark. I placed the laptop aside and picked up the phone, scrolled through the recent calls, and one by one blocked my mother, then my father, then the house line, then the neighbor, a litany performed with steady fingers and a heartbeat that slowed instead of raced. Because the more numbers I closed to my ear, the more room opened in my chest for a kind of quiet I had never known. It was not rage, not triumph. It was architecture, the slow construction of a life where I did not wake each morning already indebted to the day for the people I might be asked to carry. Of course, not everything can be sealed through a screen, and the world has a way of walking past blocks and boundaries, so when the doorbell rang the next evening I stood still for a long moment, tasting the metallic tang of memory. Then opened the peephole to see my mother on the landing with a scarf tied wrong and her eyes already wet, and although my first instinct, the automatic old loyalty, told me to open and fold her into the warmth and let December end the way every December always had. My second instinct, which had been starved for years and now had muscle, told me that opening the door would be a small betrayal that would grow teeth and devour everything I had just built. I did not let her in, and I did not let the moment become a scene, and instead I spoke through the wood with a voice that trembled but did not break, saying that I had read her email, and that I wished her safety on the way home, and that we would speak when there was something new to say rather than a pitch for the old program with a new bow. She cried then, and I leaned my forehead against the cool surface and cried too, because choosing yourself is not some cinematic triumph scored by strings. It is a long walk through an unmapped neighborhood where every porch light looks like a trap and every shadow could be a friend. When her footsteps finally retreated and the hallway swallowed the echo, I slid the chain into place, crossed back to the table, and opened another portal that had once tied me invisibly to them. The family cloud account where photos and documents lived like evidence that we existed in the same story, and I changed the password. Not to erase our past, but to end the strange present that had turned me into a storage unit for memories I was not welcome to make. I logged out, turned the phone face down, and stared at the ceiling while the evening gathered, and I thought about how revenge can look like cruelty from a distance, but, up close, sometimes resembles nothing more than the radical enforcement of fairness. The apartment hummed, the radiator whispered, and the blocked calls stacked up in silence, and I told myself I could sleep, that I could meet the morning with the same spine. And then the screen flared in the dark with a new notification from an address I did not recognize. A subject line that mentioned urgent account activity regarding your sister, and my breath caught in my throat as I tapped it open and felt the floor tilt under my feet again. The subject line with its stiff little phrase about urgent account activity sat like a cold coin in my inbox until I clicked it and found a neat, impersonal notice from the university's financial office explaining that someone had attempted to update the account holder authorization on my sister's tuition plan using my name and an electronically scribbled signature that looked like mine if you squinted, through tears and wishful thinking, and that because the digital certificate did not match the archived consent on file, the change had been flagged for review, which was the kind of bureaucratic poetry I used to translate for my family for free. Except this time the translation came with a very clear subtext that even a sleepy bursar could understand, namely that Jessica had decided the boundary I set was a soft fence rather than a wall, and that perhaps, with the right combination of panic and entitlement, she could slide back into my pocket like loose change. I felt the familiar old heat climb my throat, the one that used to send me into late-night negotiations with myself about compassion and duty, But instead of pacing the kitchen until I forgave everyone again, I opened a new email. Addressed the compliance address listed in tiny font at the bottom of the notice, and wrote a concise, steady paragraph confirming the attempted unauthorized change, attaching my previous cancellation confirmation, and stating in plain English that my financial authorization for Jessica's education had ended permanently as of the date already recorded, and that any future communication implying otherwise should be treated as fraudulent, and when I pressed send I did not shake, because there are moments when clarity can be as grounding as gravity. Within an hour a staffer replied with language so formal it almost sounded kind, thanking me for the documentation and asking whether I would also like to place a hold on transcript release until the past due balance was resolved. And while a small voice in me winced at the thought of trapping my sister's paper future behind a glass window she could not open, a louder, older voice answered that I had been holding open more expensive windows for years while freezing on the sill, and that fairness sometimes looks like the first closed door after 1,000 open ones, so I authorized the administrative hold and requested that any appeal require direct proof of independent funding, and then I called the registrar's office and, after the predictable hold music and security questions, removed my contact information from every emergency field where it had lived like a silent rescue rope tied around my waist. My phone began to shake on the countertop as if it were a small animal waking in a storm, because my mother had found another number to call from, and then another, and when calls could not reach me, emails arrived instead, some of them gentle as gauze and some of them edged like knives, suggesting that I was humiliating the family and endangering Jessica's fragile progress, and I read every single word because I wanted to know exactly what I was choosing against. And then I set the computer aside and walked to the window to watch two boys across the street haul a dry tree to the curb and slap their hands together after the job like tiny union workers who understood the satisfaction of finishing something heavy. That night, because the attempted signature had rattled a door I did not want to leave loose on its hinges, I froze my credit. I enabled two-step verification on every account that mattered, and I called the health insurer to log the attempted re-enrollment that had pinged their system earlier in the week, which the representative confirmed in a tone that suggested she heard stories like mine far more often than any holiday movie would admit. And when she asked whether I wanted to remove myself from all shared portals to prevent backdoor access, I said yes, please, remove me everywhere I do not need to be, and she did, and I hung up feeling lighter and also, if I am honest, a little sick, because setting boundaries is not a spa treatment. It is carpentry and the wood splinters. To keep my hands from reaching for the phone, I pulled an old folder from the closet that I had labeled Family Emergency Fund in the optimistic year when I believed that money with a clear name could teach a family to be honest, and I counted the balance I had quietly parked there month after month while telling myself it was a cushion for all of us, and I saw the pattern so starkly that it made me laugh. Because of course a cushion never returning to its original shape is not a cushion but a sinkhole, and I closed the account with a transfer to my own savings and a handwritten note to myself that read, "Not an emergency, a life," which I tucked into the empty folder because sometimes you need proof that you finally witnessed your own logic. The next morning a voicemail from a scholarship committee slipped past my filters because it came from a number with a generic prefix, and the message, careful and measured, asked whether I could confirm a detail on Jessica's application regarding financial independence, specifically a statement that she had provided her own support for the past several years. And I stood there barefoot on the tile with my coffee going cold while I listened to the slick little light unwind in the air, and although there was a time when I would have covered for her out of instinct and habit and misguided love, I called back and told the truth with the precision of a witness who has decided that complicity is just a prettier word for sinking. And when I hung up I felt the strange twin sensations of triumph and dread that always arrive when you finally say what you have always known. I sent one more email, this one to my parents, with a single gentle paragraph explaining that I would not be restoring any accounts or authorizations and that future attempts to sign in as me would be reported, and then, because revenge is sweetest when it is clean, I closed out the family phone plan I had been carrying like a backpack full of bricks, ported my number to a solo plan, and let the rest of the lines fall into darkness with a soft administrative click that sounded, to my ears, like a resigned sigh from a tired machine. By late afternoon, my mother's written messages had changed key from pleas to prophecy, rich with warnings about how loneliness can harden a woman into someone no one will want, and while I could feel the sharpness of those words trying to hook under my ribs, I cooked dinner slowly and ate it at the table without a phone in sight, and I wrote on a small card the only condition under which I would meet them again, a sentence plain enough to be memorized, which read, "We will talk when each of you acknowledges, out loud and without qualification, that for years you treated me as a wallet rather than a daughter," and I sealed the card in an envelope I did not address, because I wanted to see if I could live with my own terms before I mailed them. I had just set the envelope on the mantel when the doorbell rang in two impatient bursts that did not sound like a mother or a neighbor, and when I looked through the peephole I saw a uniform I did not expect and a clipboard tucked under an arm. And my heart went very still as the knock came again and a calm voice announced a welfare check requested by family, which meant someone had decided that if they could not access my accounts they would try to access my sanity. And I stood there breathing slowly while the past and the present pushed against each other on the other side of my door, and I had to decide which future I was willing to hand my keys to. The phrase welfare check sounded clinical when the man in the navy jacket said it through the door, but it arrived in my hallway carrying the sour perfume of accusation, so I breathed once, slid the chain to its middle notch, and opened just wide enough to meet his eyes, which were warm and procedural at the same time, and I said that I was safe, that I was alone, that the heat worked, that there was food in the fridge, and that I had emails documenting the boundary I had set with my family, along with a log of attempted account changes that would explain why someone might find it useful to paint me as unstable, at which point he nodded in a way that said this was not his first December spent arbitrating domestic theater. And he asked if I would step back so he could see the room, and I did, inviting him to look at the neat kitchen and the stack of laundry and the lists pinned to the corkboard like small flags of confidence, and when he finished he handed me a card with a case number written in tidy handwriting and suggested I keep it on file in case more calls arrived, a sentence that landed like both a courtesy and a forecast. I thanked him without flinching, closed the door gently, and stood with my forehead against the cool wood until the footsteps faded and the quiet returned, not the brittle quiet of being shunned, but the dense quiet of a choice that has just been defended and will have to be defended again. I am not proud of how quickly I pivot into logistics when my feelings start to riot, but the habit saved me more than once, so I wiped my eyes, opened the laptop, and built the most unromantic kind of revenge imaginable. The kind that wears a blazer and carries a clipboard, beginning with a brief letter attached to the case number and emailed to the university's financial office, the registrar, and the scholarship committee, explaining that any communication claiming to be from me should be verified by reply to my address only, and that all authorizations in my name were void as of the date already stamped on their records. Then I sent certified letters to all 3 credit bureaus with copies of my driver's license and a statement formally documenting attempted identity use, which is not a confession of crime, but a bright line painted on a street where people keep wandering into your lane. Then I logged the attempted re-enrollment with the insurer's fraud department and asked for a notation requiring verbal passphrase for any future changes, a measure the woman on the line praised as practical in a way that made me want to sit down and cry until February. When the last email went out, I opened a new document and drafted a ledger that was not an invoice and not an apology, but an artifact, each line a season of my life rendered into sentences that a stranger would understand, the years of premiums paid, the months of tuition covered, the weekends of food bought and travel booked, and at the end a total written out in words, because somehow seeing it that way made the magnitude feel less like math and more like biography, which is what it had been all along. There is a particular fatigue that comes after you make yourself legible to systems, and I felt it settle into my shoulders while the kettle warmed, which is why I almost missed the new voicemail from my mother. A message delivered in a voice hushed enough to feel like confession, where she said that Jessica had left campus early, that the scholarship would not release the spring allotment, that my father had put an old watch up for consignment, and that she remembered. Suddenly and uncomfortably, the year I took on a second shift during winter break to keep the lights on while everyone else kept the music loud, and she said she believed she had mistaken my steadiness for surplus and my quiet for consent, and she asked, in a careful sentence that swam like a fish between apology and argument, whether there was a version of love that could exist between us without the flow of money. I listened twice, because there was truth in it and performance too, and those two have always shared a closet in our house, and though I could feel every tendon in me straining toward the old reflex, I did not call back, because calling would have erased the work of an entire winter in a single leak of warmth. What I did instead felt small but exact, which is the kind of act I now trust. I printed the ledger and folded it into an envelope along with a page that held one sentence alone in the center. A line stating that any future contact must begin with each person, separately and aloud, acknowledging that for years they treated me like a wallet rather than a daughter. And that until those words were spoken without qualification, I would keep the door shut and my account silent, and I sealed the envelope without writing an address because I wanted to know whether I could live with my own terms before I demanded anyone else read them. Then, because spite ages quickly when left in the house, I gave myself a different errand and cleared the hall closet of gift bags and expensive ribbons that had always felt like stage props, returned the unused presents for store credit without explaining myself to the curious clerk, and used the credit to buy a modest carry-on with wheels that rolled cleanly. Not as a declaration that I was leaving forever, but as an object that stood for options, because options are the richest currency I had denied myself in the name of family. Late that night, when the building had gone quiet and the neighbors' television murmurs had dimmed into the kind of hush that makes a person hear her own thoughts like footsteps on tile, I sat at the table and reread a string of texts I had never answered from before Christmas, little windows into a script everyone else still believed I would perform, and I closed them, one by one, like shades. And I opened the case number file again and saved it to a folder labeled Boundaries, and then I changed my voicemail to a sentence that said I was not taking calls and that urgent matters could be sent by email, and I turned the phone face down without turning it off, because leaving it on felt like respect for the version of me that might still want a bridge someday. In the dark, I thought about all the ways a person can be wrong and still be justified, and all the ways a person can be right and still be cruel, and I admitted that my solution was neither clean nor kind, merely honest, which will have to be enough until kindness can be built on something sturdier than my credit limit. The suitcase leaned against the wall with its tag still tucked in, the envelope sat on the mantel with its thin promise inside, and when the screen lit one last time with a message from a number I knew by heart but could not bear to name, I placed the phone gently in the drawer and closed it, stood in the doorway and turned the deadbolt slowly until it clicked, and then I turned it back a quarter inch, the way you do when you are learning that boundaries can be doors as well as walls, and I left it there while the room filled with the kind of silence that does not punish or protect but waits, which is either the softest revenge I will ever allow myself or the first merciful pause in a story that has not finished deciding who I am.